Institute of Politics here at Harvard. And tonight we examine America's growing opioid crisis. I want to thank the Kennedy School's Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy for co-sponsoring our discussion tonight. Our moderator is Sheila Burke, adjunct lecturer in public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. The full account of Sheila's accomplishments in public service leadership is too long to tell, but here are just a few highlights. 4 years as executive dean of the Wiener Center, adjunct faculty at Georgetown University, member of the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing. And Sheila came by her commitment to healthcare honestly, beginning her career as a nurse in Berkeley, California. Sheila served as chief of staff to Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. Prior to her service, Sheila served with the U.S. Senate professional staff. She helped shape legislation related to Medicaid, Medicare, and other health programs. She was deputy staff director of the Senate Committee on Finance, and in 1995, she was elected Secretary of the Senate, the U.S. Senate's chief administrator. Now, Sheila, this is the second opportunity I've had to introduce you, and I don't want to let this one go by without adding a personal note. I was one of the countless women, both Democrats and Republicans, who were inspired by your leadership and your commitment to public service when you worked on the Hill. We thank you.
Thank you for that remarkably kind introduction. I thought you were going to comment on admiring me for my age, but we'll set that aside for a moment. Thank you all for being here tonight for a discussion of what I think is a remarkably important topic at a remarkably important time. In August of 2016, a letter was sent to 2.3 million nurses, physicians, dentists, and other clinicians in this country by the then Surgeon General. It was the first time in the 145-year history of the Office of the Surgeon General that such a letter was sent, calling to action providers in this country around a very specific issue, and that was around the opioid problem. The annual number of overdose deaths involving prescription and illicit drugs has nearly quadrupled since 2000. 52,000 Americans died of an overdose in 2015, 4 times as many as died from gun violence. Substance abuse and substance abuse disorders, which is in fact what they are estimated to cost us somewhere north of $400 billion a year in this country, in healthcare costs, in lost productivity, and in criminal justice costs. It is both a public health crisis, it is a crisis in our criminal justice system, and some have even suggested that it is in fact a problem of homeland security. Earlier this week, the administration announced the creation of yet another commission to essentially look at this issue, headed by Governor Christie, with members including the Secretary of HHS, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of the VA, all once again asked to help us examine what this issue is and what the problems are. The charge: to review our current practices, to recommend changes for funding, for treatment, and for law enforcement. The effort is not unlike a previous effort on the part of the Obama administration, although there is clearly a greater emphasis on the criminal justice system in this go-round. It is an issue that is much in the news and much on our minds. It is said that there were somewhere north of 250 million prescriptions for drugs, for painkillers, written in 2012. In some states, it is the multiple of the population of that state. Some states have a greater number of individuals that are on painkillers than others, but the victims are relatively young, 25 to 45 years of age. They are largely white. They are largely located in suburban and rural areas of this country. The response to the crisis varies enormously, state to state, city to city. But one thing is absolutely constant, and that the solutions are as complicated as the problems that we face. So the debate over the strategies continue. They have been decades of expense and effort faced on the criminal justice system. There have been efforts targeted at physicians and others in modifying their prescribing behavior, but this is after years where we complained that in fact physicians weren't prescribing enough and weren't managing pain adequately. So a back and forth in terms of what we thought the appropriate strategy and treatments were. And again, that challenge continues to face us today. The Domenici-Wellstone legislation, which was enacted in 2008, was an attempt finally at creating parity for mental health services, for substance abuse services with the rest of health services. Yet today, these services are still inadequate and the financing still way short. So the question that we have this evening before us is where to go from here. We have 3 people with us on the panel who are uniquely qualified to help us look at exactly these issues. Governor Pete Shumlin, the 81st governor of the state of Vermont from 2001 to 2017, who also served as the head of the Democratic Governors Association during his term in office. He devoted his 2017 State of the State to what he called the full-blown heroin crisis in Vermont. He spoke about it during both of his administrations and prescribed essentially part of the issue being the overprescription of medications. Gil Kerlikowske has worn many hats, which began in law enforcement in Florida. He was the deputy director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing during the Clinton administration. He was the chief of police in Seattle, Washington, and President Obama's drug czar, and finally is the commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Control. And then finally, David Armstrong, a senior enterprise reporter at STAT, which is affiliated with the Boston Globe, a long history of investigative reporting, and a member of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team on their observations about the 9/11 crisis. I've asked each of them to speak to us for about 10 minutes, hopefully leaving plenty of time for all of you to ask the questions about the things you care most about. And I'd like to begin with the governor. Vermont is considered, I believe, one of the most forward-thinking states in the nation for the willingness to take on complex social welfare issues and prevention, treatment, many of those issues. Tell us about what you found in Vermont and what your response was.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that great introduction. And I'm honored to be here, not only here at the Institute with all these great brains from Harvard who are concerned about this issue, but also with this panel. I worked closely with Gil when he was working hard as the president's drug czar, and we did some great things together in that time, and I know that it'll be an interesting discussion. I also want to just recognize my wife, Katie Hunt, First Lady of the great state of Vermont, former First Lady. She's glad not to have that title anymore, and it's great to have her here. And my brother by another mother, Ernie Bach, who's a Massachusetts boy, but we consider him a Vermonter. Thanks for joining us. Listen, I just want to say, be as succinct as we can, because I think we all want to have a dialogue and not a lecture. But I think, the question is a good one. Why did Vermont get into this? Why is governor did? It was actually the 2014 that I dedicated my State of the State to this issue. And why Vermont? And, just to take you briefly there, because I'm from a small state where Vermonters expect to see their governor, I probably had more contact with Vermonters than most governors have with their constituents. The result was that when I'd leave the things that governors do, give a speech to the Annual Accounts Association or give a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, I'm not talking about the organic tofu growers of Vermont. I'm talking about all classes of people, all walks of life. More often than not, I found in 2012, 2013, people would grab my jacket as I left. They'd look down in shame, and they'd tell me their stories. They'd say, Governor, I've got my grandkids, but they're mine now. Our daughter's struggling with addiction. It's opiates. Or a parent would say, we've lost our son, we've lost our daughter. We had more kids in state custody, babies, than any time in our state's history. I started thinking about this, talking about it with my team, and I started going into prisons. and talking to nonviolent offenders. I spent more time in prison, I suspect, than any other governor in America that didn't get sent there. Went voluntarily, not like they do it in Illinois. And, you know, as I talked to the nonviolent offenders, I talked to the people who were addicted, I talked to the families, and I said, holy God, I talked to judges, to mental health counselors, to drug treatment folks, to anyone that would listen. And I realized we were doing almost everything wrong, and we had a full-blown crisis. So I came back one day and I said to my staff, listen, we're going to rethink this, we're going to rework it, we're going to be bold. I don't care about taking risks. I'm in here to fix it. If we take a hit, we take a hit. But we're going to dedicate the state of the state to it. We're bringing this whole state together, and Gil came up with us, and we're going to talk about how we solve this problem, make some headway. So we did it. And my staff looked at me like I had just said, listen, I'm going to put on a ballerina outfit for the state of the state, and I'm going to do a jig. Literally. They said, you can't do that. You can do a piece. No, I said, no, it's the whole thing. We took a lot of heat for it. I always wanted to get on the cover of Rolling Stone, but not that way, but we did. You know, they had the iconic can of maple syrup with the guy in the sitting on the bottom of the tree with a needle in his arm. The tourist industry went nuts. It was front page of the many, many papers. This is why we did it. I don't think there is a sadder story about what this is doing to Vermont and to America than any other, for the simple reason that it is totally, completely, and 100% avoidable. So this is what we did. We found people who were standing in treatment lines waiting to get help, who were ready to go into treatment. We'd tell them wait a year. We had one kid, I tell this story, who got addicted, got one Oxycontin at an exam he was taking in 10th grade up in Franklin County. Came from a big dairy farm family. He got addicted hard and fast. Within 2 years, he had a 500 pill a day problem. He did everything addicts do. When he hit rock bottom, his mom calls my offices and says, I got a son, he's addicted to opiates. Can you help him? What does he do? And they said, well, is he suicidal? And she said, no, he's not suicidal, he's addicted. And they said, well, we've got waiting lines. If he's not suicidal, it's going to take about a year. About a year. So, now she was an industrious dairy farm family, by the way. She picked up the phone, called back, and said, I got a son. He's addicted. He's suicidal. Can you get him in? And by the way, 2 years later, he was back working, readjusting, fell in love, had a baby, back on a family farm. To this day, he's back fighting the addiction, but he's back. So we got Gil up. We brought everyone in. We built out treatment centers like no state has ever done before. State-of-the-art, fantastic treatment centers available to anyone that needs treatment. Did we solve the problem entirely? No, but we reduced our waiting list considerably. As we've done that and decriminalized, there's more people coming in for treatment, so obviously there's huge demand. Second, we reformed our criminal justice system. We brought in judges, we brought in the entire judicial body, we brought in everyone that would listen. And now in Vermont, if you get charged for a nonviolent offense related to addiction, we move you into treatment, we don't put you in jail. We let out the nonviolent offenders from prison. Now think about this. As a governor, like most governors, I was spending more on prisons than I was to send Vermont kids to college who couldn't afford it. That's how big a problem it is. Prison population is going through the roof. We let out the nonviolent offenders, got them into treatment, drastically cut our incarceration costs. What's it cost to go to Harvard now for a year? Does anyone know? Do any of you pay the tuition? $61,000. That's $1,000 less a year than it costs me to put you in a Vermont prison for a year, all right? So I can send folks to Harvard for less than it would cost to put you in one of my prisons for a year. So we started drastically reforming our criminal justice system, cut the incarceration rates drastically, and reduced recidivism in the process. Third, we got rescue kits than anyone would take them because people were literally dying in the streets. So we did a more aggressive, now if you go into a pharmacy in Vermont, you can get your toothpaste over the counter, you can get your Q-tips over the counter, you can get your Narcan over the counter, you can get your rescue kits. Every police force, every police officer, every firefighter, we all got them. And we've saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. Fourth, we have the lowest standard for the least number of pills to be prescribed for non-serious pain issues. So how many of you had your molars out or had a little surgery and you walk out and they give you 60 or 80 oxys and they send you out the door, right? No more in Vermont. Governor Baker's reduced it in Massachusetts. Other states have done the same. We've done that. So we're making some progress. So we should all be cheering, right? Wrong. The problem we have is that nobody has figured out how to stop the pipeline in. And I just want to go back to the opening comments that have already been made. Listen, this is the least excusable disease in America because this is self-inflicted. If I said to you, we're going to have 50,000 Americans die this year because of the choices we make, you would say, wow, well, let's all get together and solve that problem together. It was mentioned by the introduction that President Trump's just announced yet another Blue Ribbon Commission headed by Governor Christie on how we solve this problem. President Obama had the same kind of commissions. Every governor now has those commissions. Everybody's trying to solve the problem. I assert that the one thing they refuse to talk about is the solution to the problem. It's this simple. Stop passing out Oxycontin and other painkillers like candy, full stop. I ask you this question. Why weren't we having these conversations in the 1990s? Because we had not invented Oxycontin yet. When we invented Oxycontin, Purdue, the manufacturer, pleaded guilty to lying to the FDA and to the healthcare community, I'm not making this up, about claiming that it was a non-addictive painkiller, finally, that we could all take endlessly and never feel pain again. That was the sales job. They pleaded guilty, 3 of their top execs. They paid, what, a $700 million fine? They sold $11 billion of it that year, but they paid a $700 million fine. White-collar guys, they don't go to jail for lying, so they went back to work. And we all kept getting addicted. So my point is a simple one. I've testified before Congress. I've led a state try to move out of this crisis. I've advised other governors and worked together with them to try to figure out how to deal within their states. No one will take on big pharma and say in the political process, for God's sake, why don't we go back to where we were, where aspirin and Tylenol and Advil were highly revered as ways to kill minor pain, where we didn't pass out heroin like candy in pill form and then act surprised when we cut off the supply and people move to the cheaper, purer heroin that is shot in the arm. Why don't we have that conversation in America? And I would assert it's very simple. The answer is very simple. Let's talk about it. What's the answer? You don't need to be a governor to figure this out. Someone just went like this. It's money. Think about this. Not only billions sold in the pill, but then we governors get together and go, Washington, please send us money. You know what those treatment drugs are costing us? We can't afford it. Can you help us? So they do. The Affordable Care Act, thankfully, President Obama, now covers treatment drugs. Who do you think makes the treatment drugs? The same industry that makes the pill that got you the treatment drugs. How many people watch the Super Bowl here? Raise your hand. All right. What's the most expensive advertising of the year on TV? This isn't a trick question. Super Bowl. If you watched it a year ago, go Patriots. You got it. There was an ad for narcotic-induced constipation on the Super Bowl night, the most expensive. If we've got enough of this stuff out there so that it pays to advertise to everyone watching the Super Bowl to help you have a movement because you're taking so many opiates, Houston, you don't need a PhD to figure out how to solve this problem. Stop handing it out. Full stop. That's what we got to do.
Gil, you have confronted this issue in all of the positions in which you've served, most recently at Customs and Border. Help us think about this from the intervention side. The governor's raised a whole series of strategies that Vermont has put into place, some of which are criminal justice related, some of which are supply side related, some of which are prescribing behavior. Tell me how you would have approached this.
When I took office in May of '09, I was leaving the Seattle Police Department, and the captain in charge of narcotics he said, one thing you want to maybe look at when you go to head up the Office of National Drug Control Policy in the White House is the pill problem. He said, we're really seeing more of this in '09. You think as a police chief of a city of 700,000 people that you'd actually be aware of what the problem of what the problem was. But if you go back to '09, I don't think you could count on one hand the number of kind of open source regular articles that were discussing opioids. Sheila, I think, hit it very much on the head early on when she said, look, this is complicated. And as you know, someone just recently opined about health care, like who knew it could be so complicated? But let me tell you, the opioid prescription issue is unbelievably complicated. So, and we really want to get, as the governor said, into the discussion, but I want to spend just a minute to compliment him because it was relatively unknown. And frankly, if you're looking at selling tourism and all kinds of things in your state, they really don't want to hear a 28 out of the 30 minutes to talking about addiction. And the fact that people should probably look at tax dollars that can be used to fight addiction, but also on the prevention and the treatment side. Governor Shumlin was clearly one of the most courageous public leaders on this issue, and I was very proud to go up there and spend the day, not only at the treatment center, but he brought everybody to the table. And I think in a place like Vermont, that was a great place to show that it can be done. Healthcare providers, physicians, law enforcement, prosecutors, I don't think you left anybody out. And that kind of gives you that picture, that flavor of just how complicated this really is. So I'll just hit a few parts, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion also. So there's lots of blame and lots of finger pointing that's going on around this. Physicians who overprescribe. Medical schools, how much time is spent in med school when it comes to teaching about addiction? Research, there are all kinds of ways to deal with pain, pain management, but who's spending the money on the research that maybe just making those prescriptions and handing those pills out might not be the best way to manage pain? The hospital accreditation group that said, look, if a patient leaves that hospital and they check the box that they weren't happy about the pain management or that they left in pain, you as a physician and you as a hospital are going to be in trouble. Well, what's the easiest way to make sure that when they walk out of that emergency room or they leave that hospital that they're not in pain? Well, it's to give them a prescription and to give them some very powerful painkillers. Governor mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, clearly the pharmaceutical industry, but I would also say, and its sales practices to physicians about writing those prescriptions. And then you can kind of put the blame on the federal government. The federal government, one, on the Drug Enforcement Administration, no physician, no medical prescriber can actually prescribe one of these very powerful painkillers without having a license from the Drug Enforcement Administration. So was DEA doing enough, and were they doing enough to make sure that there wasn't diversion? And DEA can also control the total number of pills that are manufactured in any of these controlled substances on a yearly basis. So you can look at the federal government. And then lastly, you can also look at, of course, state governments. The federal government doesn't regulate how medicine is handled and prescribed. That is all done at the state level. So are the states and were the states doing enough? And we'll talk about, as the governor also mentioned, Narcan or naloxone to help reduce overdoses. There's no probably better state right now also besides Vermont than the state of Massachusetts that has literally saved people from an overdose death by issuing this, and now to have it available in stores is also very helpful. So it's a terrific set of complex, difficult issues that I think we're making headway on, but I don't think anybody in this room or anybody on this panel does not believe that there's still a lot more that can be done.
Gil, let me ask you to just pause for a second, and then I want to turn to David. You mentioned diversion. And one of the challenges that are faced are not necessarily, well, include not only the ordering of prescriptions for individuals and the number of prescriptions they're given, but also the diversion of those prescriptions. And I wondered, in the context of your work, and also, Governor, in the context of the work in Vermont, to what extent were you able to deal with the diversion issue, and what were the tools necessary to be able to prevent that from occurring, the parent to the child, to the grandchild? I mean, what were effective strategies?
So everybody knows that next month, right, in April, will be Drug Take-Back Day. If you look at, and I was just out helping my mother move to supported living, and I'm looking at all of the medicines. There are tons of medicines. Some of them are very powerful painkillers. They're sitting in people's medicine cabinet. Drug Take-Back Day means that you can turn all of these things in and get rid of them because they need to be gotten rid of in a safe and effective way. And on the tours around the country that I did, Southern Ohio, Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, you know, I met a teacher who had become addicted to the painkillers. He lost everything, lost his wife, lost his 2 children, certainly lost his job as a teacher. But he finally said, you know, the greatest compliment I had, he's been in recovery now a couple of years, he said the greatest compliment I had was from my grandmother in West Virginia. He said, when I go and visit her, I'm allowed to use the bathroom. And of course, in the past, he wasn't allowed because he would be taking things out of there. So there's that diversion. There's also prescription drug monitoring programs that we can talk about. All but one state, the state of Missouri. They're waiting to be shown, I guess. The state of all but one state has a prescription drug monitoring program that a physician or a prescriber can go ahead and take a look at to see if David is going to 5 different physicians for the same type of complaint and essentially going after those pills. So I'd say those 2 areas of diversion. And then later on we can talk about maybe border issues and then the issues of the governor.
Good. David.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And just by way of background quickly for those of you who maybe are not familiar with STAT, we're a new publication. We're about a year plus old. We were started by the owner of the Boston Globe, who saw a need for a national publication that was really focused on medicine, health, and science, and do it sort of in a different way. And one of the first things that we talked about when we started STAT was the opioid crisis. And to our mind, there's no bigger public health crisis in this country right now, whether you measure it by lives lost, money, and sort of things that are harder to measure, like the impact on families and communities. This has been a devastating decade plus now of this crisis. I also think it's important, to the governor's point, to recognize and really understand the past. And one of the things we did at STAT was go to court in Kentucky and in West Virginia to unseal secret records about the marketing of OxyContin. Because Purdue Pharma settled nearly every case, including the federal government case, with confidentiality agreements and secrecy agreements that did not allow access to the records of how this drug was not only marketed, but how it was studied. And we also went after the only deposition we know of a member of the family that owns Purdue Pharma, which has, as you know, sold billions and billions and billions of dollars of this drug, but really has not commented in any way about the impact of this drug on the country. So we actually won that case, but Purdue was appealed. So we're in the appeal process on that. In West Virginia, we were successful in getting the records. And I think it's important for this reason. There's a lot of revisionist history going on at this moment in terms of how we got to where we are. And it's interesting to see the pushback now against efforts in Vermont and Massachusetts to restrict these drugs. A lot of physicians, a lot of pain patient groups, are very upset about this and pushing back in a major way, including the new CDC guidelines, which say that opioids should not be the first line of treatment for chronic pain. That's a big deal. So we've been really focused on not only exploring the past, but understanding it and looking at what's happening today. And it's funny, I just want to read this to you quickly because I found it interesting. I just stumbled across this in light of the debate today about whether we restrict the use of these medications, particularly in chronic pain. And it was an editorial in USA Today from 2001. So really, sort of as this problem is becoming a nationwide problem, they took the DEA to task for suggesting that OxyContin should be regulated. And they wrote that the DEA has also told Congress that it is considering limits on supplies of the painkiller, even though it's used by more Americans than Viagra. The relevance of that I still don't understand, but this is more relevant. Unless the Bush administration steps in and stops those plans, thousands of Americans in serious pain from devastating illnesses could be deprived of the painkiller their doctors believe is most appropriate. And they also go on to say, and this is not to pick on USA Today, this was sort of representative of a lot of the commentary at the time, that the efforts by the DEA to regulate and restrict OxyContin undermine the decade-long fight to reform pain treatment. That echoes today. We're hearing a lot of the same arguments that we're depriving people of medication to treat pain with these drugs. And I'm very sympathetic to these people. I hear from them quite often. There's a lot of people in this country in pain, and sort of the tragedy there is they're not getting relief. Or they're getting just very modest relief. But we've done a really horrible job of developing better medications for pain treatment, or with insurance companies, for instance, paying for non-pharmaceutical interventions with pain. So that's something that has to change if we're going to really address this problem. I'll say one more thing before we have a discussion. I think in the last year and a half, this problem, a new element has introduced itself that's really terrifying, and that's fentanyl. And it's scary for a lot of reasons, one of which is just a small amount, say a sugar packet, can result in tens of thousands of dollars in profit for a drug dealer. And people are ordering it from China, online. It's being delivered by US mail. We did a story out of Lubbock, Texas, about a guy operating a fentanyl ring from his trailer with a laptop, ordering fentanyl from China. And as soon as it hit Lubbock, people started dying. Once they shut that down, people stopped dying. This is a menace, and I don't think there's really an easy answer for how we're going to deal with fentanyl, because it's very difficult to stop the flow into this country. It's extremely potent. It's killing people. If we didn't have Narcan, the magnitude of the problem we've been talking about, as bad as it is today, would be even worse. So we have to figure out what we're going to do about fentanyl and heroin. And prescription painkillers remain a leading killer. The most recent statistics that came out with 32,000 opioid deaths, more than half of those were from prescription opioids. So that can't be forgotten in this debate. And as everyone said, it's complicated. One last point regarding the treatment of constipation related to opioid use. Last week, Purdue Pharma received approval to sell a medication to treat that condition. So I thought that was ironic.
So what goes around comes around.
That's for sure.
There are microphones on either side. I would encourage you to stand up and line up and get your questions ready. I will ask you, when you ask a question, to identify yourself and to put a question mark at the end of your question. And as we wait for folks to line up, let me ask each of you whether you have any further observations based on what you've heard from your colleagues. I think the fentanyl question is a very interesting one. I mean, Gil, it raises the questions of custom and border control and how, in fact, we're dealing with this sort of extraordinary influx across the borders of heroin products generally, but certainly of fentanyl, and where you see, you don't hear much about that as being part of the solution, but this question of customs and border control, if you might want to comment on that, and then we'll turn to my left and the gentleman in the first mic. So Gil.
So just a couple quick comments on that. Fentanyl, which has been a pain reliever that has been around a long time, and it was, for a while, it was diverted from places like nursing homes, people that are in hospice care, et cetera. But now it all comes from China. And mostly it comes through air cargo and is delivered because such a small amount of fentanyl can be used to either enhance heroin or to enhance another drug. And I think that's been a cause of a number of the overdoses also. But I think David brought up a good point, and I hope somebody raises more discussion about it, and that is the kind of pushback that's going on right now and who's behind it. When you see these patient groups saying, I can no longer get treatment for my severe or chronic pain, who's organized that group? Who's paying those costs to get that information out there, et cetera? It's big business.
Okay. Governor?
Mostly big pharma. The only thing I'd add to the fentanyl discussion is I'd caution us against thinking it's a border problem. If you go back and look at just in this last election, we make plenty of fentanyl right here in the United States of America, and we pass that out with great abundance too, enthusiasm. If you look at the last election of the states that put medical marijuana or other legalization, including Massachusetts, on the ballot, the only one that went down was Arizona. If you go do the research, the main funder of the anti-medical marijuana in Arizona was the fentanyl manufacturers in Arizona, of which there's one very prominent one. So my point is, fentanyl is a problem. Right before I was done being governor, I got a call from Governor Kasich, because we've worked together on, he's very good on a lot of these issues. Ohio's had a huge problem. And he says, Governor, I'm just calling you to give you a heads up. We got car fentanyl now in Ohio. I said, well, what the hell's car fentanyl? He goes, car fentanyl is the fentanyl that veterinarians use to put big things to sleep, like an elephant that's out of control or a lion that's out of control. And he said 2 grams, 3 grams, grains of this stuff will kill you. So we've got a fentanyl problem right here within our own borders that we could clean up.
To my left.
Hi, my name is Vince, and I'm a junior at the college. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My question concerns something that Governor Shumlin said. He mentioned that there's a concern that people switch to heroin after getting addicted to prescription drugs because it's cheaper. And something you guys all said also was that you all supported like tighter restrictions on cutting prescription drugs. My question is then, would that force people who are currently addicted to prescription drugs to move to fentanyl or heroin more quickly if doctors are prescribing traditional opioids less?
Gil?
Yeah, let me just take a stab at that. I think your point is excellent, because there are a number of people that are using heroin, and it's not really as much because they can't get a prescription for an opioid or a painkiller. It's because they have become so expensive. So if they were used to a particular pill that could be, depending on the black market, $60 or $80, and they can get the same relief for their addiction with $5 worth of heroin. So I think it's less about, it's harder to get prescription drugs. It's just one, it is somewhat harder, but it's also more expensive.
The only thing I'd add is that my own mom said to me, and I've been working on this for years the other day, I don't understand the connection between painkillers and heroin. I said, Mom, let me put it to you in plain English. Oxycontin is heroin in pill form. So I go back to your question. I don't think that one is worse than the other. I think they're both terribly, terribly destructive to your future.
The other point I think to remember is that prescription painkillers are offered a gateway to heroin. There's a government statistic that 4 out of 5 new heroin users were abusing painkillers. So there is a relationship there, but I think Gil's right. It at some point becomes a financial thing. And the Mexican cartels were very smart in a very cynical and evil way. When they saw what was happening in this country, they said, hey, we've got something just as good, if not better, that we can get there a lot cheaper. And they're very good at distributing it.
It's never been cheaper. I don't believe in history
Yeah,
of
no,
America.
the purity's never been better, and the price has never been lower.
Hi, my name is Kezia, and I'm an undergraduate here. My question is, how do you reconcile the fact that addiction had to affect white suburbia in order for it to become a politically viable health issue?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very end of the question.
How do you reconcile the fact that it had to affect white suburbia in order for this to become a politically viable health issue?
That's a great question. And the answer is, in my view, no different than every other issue in American politics. It's got to hit white people before government responds.
I would imagine as well that the sheer magnitude has changed. I mean, we've had a long history of heroin abuse, cocaine, but the magnitude of the number of deaths, the distribution across the country, I think the issue of the fact that it is hitting largely white, sort of suburban, rural, has certainly hit the papers much more clearly than something happening in Harlem, which has happened for a very long period of time. So its exposure, its scale, and in fact it's hitting different communities, I think is exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, the prescription drug issue is an equal opportunity. I mean, it cuts across every demographic, every economic line, et cetera. What's interesting about heroin is it's kind of skipped a generation. So people thought about heroin and they said, gee, heroin's usually in the inner city. It's in Bronx, it's in Baltimore, et cetera. Heroin has always had more white addicts than it has had African American addicts. The other part about heroin is when it skipped a generation, because really it wasn't on the radar screen until the last few years, that's because a lot of young white suburbanites looked at heroin and said, well, you know what, as long as I smoke it or I snort it, I'm not going to become an injecting drug user. And of course, within weeks, they become an injecting drug user.
But I mean, I'm not trying to be flip, but the bottom line is,
Yeah.
I have not met an issue yet where if it doesn't hit the soccer moms, it doesn't get a response. And this one's hitting the soccer moms, hate to say it, but it was always the other people's problem. Now it's everybody's problem. And, you know, I'll give you an example. I was, several months ago, the governor of Nevada calls me and said, listen, we're getting killed. I mean, we're killing people out here. We're seeing huge numbers of people die. But every time I get this call from a governor, it's usually this story, and he told it. He said, my neighbor's son, we loved him. He was on the football team, all-star player, high school, got a hip injury, started on the pills, became a full flood, he died. So the First Lady and I are going to devote a 3-day conference, it was a very effective conference, to what we do in Nevada. Governor Sandoval and the First Lady really went at it. But it's like so many things in the power base of America. Until it hits white America, policies and politicians don't move.
To my left, and one of the things I do want Gil and the governor to comment on, if you can, during the course of our conversation, and that's this issue of decriminalization. You raised it as a strategy in Vermont. The fact that you began to look differently at those individuals, nonviolent criminals, essentially putting them into treatment rather than incarceration. This question of decriminalization, this question of the role of the courts, is clearly going to come back at us again. And I'll be interested in hearing from both of you your observations as to whether that, in fact, is the strategy. That is to rethink what, in fact, the first intervention is. Is the first intervention a treatment strategy rather than a criminal strategy? But let me ask this gentleman your question.
Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Aaron Boslin. I'm studying education policy over at the Ed School. And my question is for Governor Shumlin. I asked you at lunch today about courage, and you denied that label, but I think it's true, and Gil used the word to describe you as well. So I want to talk about political courage and where you've seen, you mentioned Governor Kasich is good on this issue. When you think about the people you've interacted with who are in political leadership, and especially considering you've become such a leading voice on this, What factors have you seen that give these leaders political courage compared to those who don't want to touch this?
I think there's a very simple answer to that one. The reason that we don't change our policies on the question you just asked, decriminalization, how we approach this as a criminal issue instead of a healthcare issue, which is what it is. The reason you don't get bold proposals is because in the end, it comes from governors. In the end, the buck stops with you. And when you reform a system like this, like anything, something always goes wrong. So if you're in a position like this, where you're literally letting people, I'd let hundreds and hundreds of people out of prison, right? That's not on the top list, to-do list for governors, right? Because one of those people is going to disappoint you and hurt somebody. It's just inevitable, right? Law of averages. So the challenge we have with this issue is twofold. One, there's a huge amount of money being made, right? Huge amount of money. The drug painkillers, the constipation, the Narcan that we're all talking about, hugely expensive, the treatment drugs. I mean, you go through the list, there's just Correction Corporation of America, you name it, just huge money. The second problem is most political office holders think that their dream is to go even further, and they are risk adverse. And you cannot solve this problem if you're risk adverse.
One group that really helps, because not all the governors exhibit quite the spine that this governor did, but one thing that can help when you're doing a spinal transplant for an elected official is that if you have the police chief and the prosecutor
Yes.
and the sheriff all standing there saying, look, treatment works, prevention works, we need to invest more money in the healthcare issue, et cetera. That can be quite helpful, I think, and supportive for an elected official, then whether it's a mayor or a governor, to take a stand on these issues.
And let me give you some hope. When I gave my State of the State in 2014, think about it, it wasn't that long ago, people thought I was crazy. I took the tourist industry almost hung me in Vermont, because think about it. Little teeny state, what do you think of when you think of Vermont, right? Skiing, best maple syrup in the world, right? Best ice cream, right? Ben & Jerry's, mountains, lakes. Everybody wants to go there if they're sane. Bernie, all these good things. You don't think heroin addiction, right? So they're like, get that governor and throttle him, you know? I mean, imagine what, Stowe Mountain was saying to me that week, or what Jay Peak was saying to me that week, or what the maple syrup manufacturers, for that matter, were saying to me that week, right? So my point is simple. You got to find a way to personalize this. And I remember Al Gore is alleged to have said that he helped invent the internet. I'm giving him credit, say helped invent the internet. I'm here to tell you, I was part of a small group of people that invented civil unions. Now, we invented civil unions long before it was fashionable. We took a lot of heat. What's wrong with those crazies up there? This was 15 years ago almost, right? What is wrong with them in Vermont, letting people like that almost get married with civil unions, right? Now we look at it 15 years later, everybody's got marriage equality. We don't look so crazy anymore. My point is, it was equally crazy when I dedicated my State of the State to this issue, and people are like, what's going on in Vermont? They got a heroin problem. No one else has it. No one else is having this problem. What's going on in the Green Mountain State? 3 years later, everybody's on it. So I think there's a lot of reason for hope here.
Thank you.
To my right, and another issue I'd like the three of you to comment on is the role of physicians and dentists. The suggestion that you made in terms of rethinking the ordering strategy, putting in place registries, other tools that might be used. Gil made the point about whether or not, in fact, people are being trained and educated to rethink the whole question of pain management. But to what extent did you get pushback from the medical society in Vermont? So I'll be interested in hearing you talk about that. Question.
Yes, my name is Ann. I am standing before you as, a concerned citizen. My husband's a physician, so you can imagine I have a lot to say. And sadly, also as a stepmother to a 23-year-old son who died 3 days after Christmas, just this past Christmas.
Sorry to hear.
Thank you.
Thanks for having the courage to talk about it, because you're helping us out.
We made sure everyone knew what he died of, because it's really important that everybody knows. We are
Absolutely.
sadly white privileged, you know, upper middle class, have all the tools available to us, and our son still died after a relapse.
Yep.
So I'm going to say a little bit of a pushback about the physician thing. I know my husband and his colleagues, they don't give out prescriptions. They are drilled on it. UMass Medical, thank goodness, safe prescriber course now for all students, which Charlie Baker made a big deal about, and we're kind of at the forefront, as
Yes.
Massachusetts, we should be.
Yep.
I think the medical community is a little flat-footed in the response. So we have someone who takes opioids, either prescribed or diverted. They could become addicted. We find out, we're like, no more, you're out of here. They're still addicted. What are they gonna do? Only 5% of the physicians in Massachusetts have the ability to prescribe Suboxone, which is a very good treatment. And everyone could learn how to do it. I'm wondering how we can induce physicians to become able to prescribe it. It's an 8-hour online class that costs, I think, $200. How do we induce them to do this? How do we make it less of a problem to help our kids? They should be treated by their primary physicians. What can we do to do that?
Great question. I'm going to give you the answer, at least from Vermont's perspective. So my biggest challenge was changing attitudes about this disease. And so I kept telling a story. I'd say, listen, while I was fighting this battle, my dad got cancer. He didn't survive it. We knew he wouldn't. When he went to get treatment for it, they told him, as they do now, you know, this isn't a genetic issue, just want you kids and everything else to know. This is actually behavioral. He was a smoker. So he's got cancer of the esophagus. It's created from the smoking. You should know that it's not necessarily genetic, it's behavioral. And we didn't say to him, and the medical community didn't say to him, hey, buddy, you know, you made some pretty dumbass life choices. So you're going to go to the back of the line. We are pretty busy up here at Dartmouth-Hitchcock right now. We'll see you in 6 or 8 months. That's what we do with this disease. We put them at the back of the line. The other challenge I found when I went and talked to physicians quietly about why we didn't have enough to do treatment, and we've all got this problem, they literally would say to me, I say, tell me everything, I'll never repeat it, I'll never say your name, why won't you? You know what they would often say to me? To tell you the truth, I'm worried that my other clients don't want those people in the office. We don't want them in a waiting room. Some of them don't have teeth. Some of them are really dirty. Some of them are really down and out. That isn't the kind of person we want in our waiting room, Governor. So I went around and started talking to the docs. Literally, I'd show up. I'd say, I want to talk to you in the areas where we needed treatment. And I said, you went to medical school because you took an oath. And it was to save lives. Look what's happening. This is killing more Vermonters than anything else right now who otherwise would be alive. Can you help me? Can you help me? I'll talk about this as a disease every single day if you'll treat them every single day. And it worked. We started changing attitudes. I started taking other doctors with me that I talked into it to talk to the other docs. And I was amazed how fast they started signing up. But it required the leader to make it a moral imperative. My son, your son, no more. And they moved. Doctors are the best people in the world, nurses, physicians, healthcare providers. They wouldn't be in that business. So you gotta have leadership from the top that says, listen, it matters to me. This is why it should matter to you. And they get over the, oh, there's someone who smells in the waiting room every once in a while, you know. They get over the person who's out on the street struggling but's gotta come in. And it works. But you gotta change the culture.
Thank you.
I think that when I first looked at the problem, dentists were the #1 prescribers of everyone. And we went to Chicago, we went to the American Dental Association. They really took on this issue. Dentists are no longer the #1 prescriber. And I was interested, getting a root canal, and was interested in what I'm going to get prescribed. It was ibuprofen, and instead of the traditional painkiller, which was a big step in the right direction. I also think physicians actually have made the greatest progress in this area. I also think, though, that when you think about a primary care physician trying to also do some type of treatment, whether it's buprenorphine or Suboxone or others, it's almost such a specialty, and it's as you know and your husband knows, it's much more than just making that prescription for some alternative, and that's why I think there's that being able to hand that patient off with the support of that primary care physician to someone who's a treatment specialist would often be the best. But I think those days of when Tom Frieden was the head of the CDC, Tom said when he went to medical school and was learning about pain management, his instructors, his doctors told him, look, you can prescribe as much of this addictive, they didn't call it that then, because as long as someone is in real pain, they won't become addicted. No, nothing could be further from the truth.
Let me just close by saying we actually changed the entire delivery system in Vermont. It's a stupid name. We call it hub and spoke. We got all the physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, healthcare, mental health folks, everybody in. The way it works is, think about it as a hub and spoke. The spokes are the primary care physicians. They now go hunting for addiction in your annual checkup. When they sense that they've got a problem, they feed you into the hub, which is our treatment centers, mental health counselors, the rest. The judges and the judiciary is involved in feeding people in, and that's done more to change attitudes by having a holistic response than I think anything else that we did.
We are not surprisingly using all our time, so I'm going to try and do a lightning round.
Great.
Which means quick question, quick answer.
You got it.
So,
Okay, great. I'm Laura Klauberg. I'm a fellow in the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. My question's about prevention. I wonder if you could speak to anything that's particularly innovative that's happening in that space, particularly targeted towards young people, middle school, high school age kids.
So I'll be very brief answer. Nothing that's worked. There's nothing I know of that can give us any hope on prevention. Maybe Gil and others see it differently. We tried almost everything, and I haven't heard. Listen, I find this one so frustrating. We wouldn't need prevention if we change the way we deal with pain management in America. I just can't see that enough. So we can keep like gerbils on that wheel. We can keep, and we're going to keep losing more good people. We're going to keep going to funerals. We're going to keep facing this horrific story of 50,000 Americans a year, really? Do you guys remember when the terrorist got on the plane with a bomb in his
shoe,
and he tried to light it, remember? He failed, he couldn't do it. Everyone got off the plane. What was our response? One person on one airplane. Yeah, now you take your shoes off when you go through, right? Everyone's off with the shoes now. Imagine if we lose one American every 20 minutes. There's probably more now, every 15, I don't know. Imagine that I said there's a disease in America where if you got a group of 100 people in a room, every 20 minutes one of you gets hauled out. How many people would hang around here? It's just incredible to me that we keep having this conversation like, what do we do about this problem? This is not difficult to solve. We didn't have it before, the painkillers. Don't worry about who gets the blame. Everyone says, oh, don't blame the doctors. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm blaming all of us. All of us go, it's okay to keep treating pain this way so that we lose 50,000 good people, one person every 20 minutes. That's insane. Imagine that it was terrorism. We wouldn't be just taking our shoes off. We'd all be hiding in little bunkers in our basements. Every 20 minutes, a terrorist takes another one of us out. We would be. We'd be all bunkered up. You'd be calling in your food. You know, I don't know. This is solvable, but it's prevention. Gil, you tell me if I'm wrong, David. We haven't found anything that is truly effective.
Yeah, on the opioids, I think it's really improved a lot with physicians because you have contracts now, they sit down. Before, most people, when they go into their physician, the physician says, take one pill every 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever. You don't even know what it is and you don't pay any attention. Now, when they're prescribing a painkiller, they spend some time.
I just want to make a real quick point, and I'm sorry this doesn't directly answer your question because I think the governor's right, and that is regarding treatment. The situation's scandalous. Because only 10 to 20% of people that need treatment are getting it. And the irony here is, I forget, it was Anne? You know, what you did with being honest about how your stepson died, lots of people are doing that now, and that's good because it's removing some of the stigma. The irony is, one of the best medications for treating addiction is in fact an opioid. And there's a huge stigma wrapped around that. And a lot of people, especially in law enforcement, don't like that, and we got to change that.
We are, in fact, over time. I'm going to give you the last question, and then I'm going to make a very quick wrap-up.
Perfect, thank you. So my name is Taylor Marquis. I'm a junior here at the college studying biology and government. I was raised in St. Albans, Vermont, which is, unfortunately, arguably one of the most drug-infested towns in the most drug-infested county, in the most drug-infested state, in the most drug-infested country in the whole world. In the summer after my senior year of high school, I worked at a community health clinic in Franklin County, where I spent most of my time actually working with Suboxone patients. And oftentimes after they would come in and fail a drug test, or if the presence of Suboxone wasn't present, I would have to be one of the persons who would tell them that we would have to withhold their Suboxone. And Suboxone has become a very, very popular treatment among people who are addicted to opiates. But I was wondering, do you think that it could be possible that it's very popular for some of the wrong reasons? Do you think it is actually the best way to be treating this disorder, treating a drug addiction with another very, very addictive drug? These patients, when I told them we're withholding your Suboxone, would go through, symptoms of anxiety and almost withdrawal. Is it the best way to treat an addiction, or is it the most convenient way to treat an addiction?
Quick answer.
Well, it's frankly the best of some not great options.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be done in a vacuum. You talk to any treatment specialist, it has to be done with cognitive behavioral therapy and other tools that are given to people that are doing it. But, Narcotics Anonymous, people detoxing 3 days and then getting discharged, that's not working. The relapse rates are horrific. So I had a hard time wrapping my head around that concept as well, replacing one opioid with another. But people are able to function and to live and not to relapse, a lot of them, when they're doing this, and it's being done in the proper way.
We have touched on a variety of alternatives, issues around treatment centers, financing, decriminalization, the rescue kits, availability of the rescue kits, the training of our providers, and new strategies and new opportunities, the standard and registries with respect to pills, and the direction of individuals towards the kind of services they need, all things that we have talked about. We have folks here who have been extraordinary examples and leaders in this fight. It is not the end of this conversation. It is the beginning of a very long conversation. You will see in your programs, actually, those of you that pick them up, there is a class actually online about the opioid crisis that is being offered by Harvard, which has just begun. I'd encourage you to take a look at that, but please join me in thanking our terrific panel.